The metal ramp of the LVT hit the shallow water of White Beach 2 with a heavy mechanical clang that vibrated straight up into my chest. In that single fracturing second, the safety of the steel tractor vanished, replaced by a blinding chaos of white coral dust, black smoke, and the scream of shrapnel cutting the humid air. The engine behind us was roaring, a deep whine struggling against the reef, but its sound was swallowed by the chatter of Japanese Nambu machine guns firing from the concrete bunkers to our left. I was paralyzed for a moment, my hands frozen around the wooden stock of my M1 Garand. The heat inside the vehicle had been suffocating during the 45-minute run-in. A mix of sweat-soaked green dungarees, greasy Cosmoline, and the exhaust fumes of 29 other men crammed shoulder to shoulder. Some recruits had vomited into their helmets, the sour smell mixing with the stench of fear and wet wool. We had stood there in silence, listening to the Navy's big guns, hoping they were doing the job. But the air that rushed in when the ramp dropped was a physical wall of heat, easily 115 degrees, carrying the smell of scorched iron, burnt diesel oil, and the dry, bitter scent of pulverized limestone. "Move! Get off the tractor! Hit the sand!" The voice belonged to Sergeant Hardy. I saw the private in front of me, a boy whose name I never learned, his helmet strap dangling loose. Step onto the iron ramp. He took one step before his body jerked violently, his chest collapsing as a burst of machine gun fire caught him. He fell backward, his pack pinning him to the metal floor. The water washing over the ramp turned oily red, mixing with the fuel puddles at our feet. I scrambled over his body, my boots slipping, and threw myself over the side of the ramp into the waist-deep water. The water was warm, almost hot, and thick with fuel that stung my eyes and the cuts on my knuckles. The weight of my pack pulled me down, dragging my knees against the jagged reef. The coral of Peleliu is a sharp skeletal rock, calcified and jagged, that cuts through trousers and flesh. My knees hit the bottom, and I felt the cloth rip, followed by the sharp burn of salt water entering the open scrapes. All around me, the sea was boiling. Geysers of water and mud shot 40 feet into the sky as mortar rounds registered on the reef line. To my left, an LVT was hit directly in the cab. The explosion was a dull thump that threw a sheet of orange flame across the water, followed by the sound of men screaming inside a burning steel box. I kept my head down, keeping my rifle high. My fingers were numb, stiffened by terror, and the steel of the receiver felt cold and alien. A heavy shell exploded 20 yards to my right. The concussion hit me like a solid board across the chest, driving the air from my lungs and pushing me down into the shallow water. For a long, terrifying 10 seconds, there was no sound, only a sharp ringing that vibrated inside my skull, and the taste of sulfur and salt in my throat. I watched the black smoke drift across the bright sky, my mind refusing to accept that this burning strip of rock was the place they had promised would be ours in 72 hours. I dragged myself onto the dry sand, crawling toward the low ridge of the beach. The glare was blinding. The white coral reflected the tropical sun with an intensity that burned the eyes. Every palm tree that had lined the shore had been splintered into white toothpicks by the naval bombardment, leaving nothing but a flat, exposed wasteland under a burning sky. We had been told this would be a short, clean affair. Only a day before, aboard the USS DuPage, the officers had pointed to rubber relief maps showing Peleliu as a neat, flat oval. They told us the Navy's guns would pulverize the island's defenses. 3 days, the captain had said. We secure the airfield, clear the high ground, and we'll be back on the transports before the beer gets warm. I had believed him. In the pocket of my utility jacket, wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with twine, was my diary, a small notebook I had bought in San Diego. On its early pages, I had recorded the simple details of our journey, the taste of powdered eggs, card games on the mess tables, the quiet anxiety of the recruits. I had written about Bobby Miller, a kid from the farm country of Illinois who shared my last name but none of my blood. He had spent the eve of the landing polishing his belt buckle, talking about how his mother had told him Peleliu looked like a tropical paradise in the geography books. Now, Bobby was huddled next to me behind a shattered palm log, his face covered in a mixture of dark sand and dried blood that had splattered from another man's wound. His uniform clean hours ago was torn at the elbows, the raw coral dust turning his skin gray. He was shaking, his knees pulled to his chest, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the burning LVT. The optimism of Illinois had died the moment the ramp hit the water. Beside him was Bradley, our BAR man. Bradley was 23, but he had the cold, hollow look of a man who had already left his youth somewhere in the mud of Cape Gloucester. He lay flat, the heavy rifle resting on its bipod. He didn't look at the burning vehicles or the men screaming for corpsmen in the shallows. Slowly, methodically, he wiped a thin layer of coral dust from the bolt with his thumb, his fingers moving with a mechanical precision. "Hardy," I whispered, my voice cracked and dry, the salt having dried on my lips into a white, stinging crust. "Where's the rest of the squad?" Sergeant Hardy didn't answer immediately. He was leaning against the log, his helmet pushed back, showing the deep, dark circles under his eyes. He was 28, but his face looked as if it had been carved from the dry gray clay. His hands were trembling with a fine vibration that he tried to hide by locking his fingers around his garand. He looked back toward the reef, where 2 more tractors were burning, their crews jumping into the water under a crossfire. "They're not coming, Daniel," Hardy said, his voice flat. "Most of them are still in the lagoon. We have to move. If we stay here, they'll have us ranged in 5 minutes." He was right. The Japanese mortars were already adjusting their fire, the shells walking down the beach in neat, deadly increments. The sound of the explosions was a dull crump that sent fragments of coral singing through the air. The heat was rising from the ground, the white rock radiating the sun's energy back into our faces, until our skin felt stretched and blistered. My canteen, filled with warm, metallic-tasting water, was heavy against my hip, but I was afraid to drink. The thirst was a constant, dry ache in my throat, but the thought of opening the cap under this rain of dust made my stomach turn. "There's a mortar crater 50 yards up, near the edge of the scrub," Hardy muttered, his eyes scanning the open ground ahead. "Bradley, cover the left. Miller, you take the kid and follow me. We run on 3. Bradley didn't speak. He simply nodded, his shoulder tightening against the wooden stock. 1, 2, 3. We rose and ran. The movement was a desperate scramble through the loose sand. The heat doubled the moment we left the shelter of the log, the hot air rushing into my lungs like steam. The sound of the Nambu machine guns followed us, the bullets kicking up small, white geysers of coral dust around our boots. I could hear Bobby's heavy, panicked breathing behind me. My own chest was burning, my throat so dry that each breath felt like swallowing sand. We threw ourselves over the lip of the crater, sliding down into the loose, white gravel. Hardy came in last, his boots kicking a shower of dust over my head. For a minute, we lay there, gasping for air, the heat inside the hole even more intense than on the beach, trapped by the steep walls. As I turned onto my side to check the action of my garand, my hand brushed against something rigid buried beneath the surface of the loose gravel. I brushed the white dust away, my fingers scraping against a layer of dark, waterproof canvas. It was a long package, wrapped tightly in oil-treated cloth and bound with hemp cord. It had been buried deliberately, the gravel over it smoothed down to blend with the rest of the crater. Inside lay a Japanese Arisaka Type 99 rifle. The weapon was in immaculate condition. The dark reddish wood of the stock was polished, free of the coral dust that was currently clogging our own weapons. The metal of the barrel and the bolt was coated in a fresh, thick layer of cosmoline, smelling of grease and oil. It was laid there, as if it had just been delivered from a factory, completely untouched by the fire and steel that had torn the beach apart. I reached out to lift the rifle, but Hardy's hand slammed down on my wrist, his grip like iron. "Don't touch it, Miller," Hardy hissed, his eyes darting to the ridge above us, where a thin line of gray smoke marked an enemy position. "Leave it right where it is. The enemy doesn't leave clean weapons behind when they retreat, unless they want you to pull them. Look at the dirt under the stock. There's a tripwire rigged to a grenade buried in the coral." I froze, my fingers inches from the polished wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peered closer through the white dust and saw the thin copper wire running from the rifle's buttplate down into the loose gravel. It was a booby trap, a silent death waiting for any curious Marine. "What is it, Daniel?" Bobby asked, his voice trembling as he crawled closer, his eyes dropping to the rifle in the sand. "It's an invitation to get your arm blown off," Hardy said, his voice harsh. "They set these traps in the shell craters because they know exactly where we're going to seek shelter. They've mapped out every yard of this beachhead. They don't need to see us to kill us. This whole beach is a registered grid for their mortars. Forget the rifle. Just stay low." I backed away, a cold dread settling in my gut. The Arisaka lay there, clean and ready in the sand, a silent testament to the calculated trap we had walked into. The enemy hadn't been destroyed by the tonnage of naval shells we had poured onto the island. They had simply moved below the surface, waiting for us to enter their targeted killing zones. "Hardy," Bradley said, his voice quiet, his eyes still fixed on the sights of his BAR. "We've got movement in the scrub. 200 yards out. They're setting up a mortar." Hardy wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, leaving a smear of black grease across his forehead. "Miller, check your clip. Bobby, get your rifle up. We have to clear that pocket before they range this hole. We can't stay in this grave." I picked up my Garand, checking the receiver. The bolt was dry, the grease already contaminated by the fine white coral dust. When I pulled the operating rod back, it made a dry scraping sound. The heat was pressing down on us, a heavy, stagnant weight that made every movement feel as if we were underwater. I looked back down at the spot where the Arisaka had been buried. The paper Hardy had crumpled was already half covered by the shifting sand, the words disappearing beneath the white dust of Peleliu. The beach behind us was still in flames, the screams of the wounded rising and falling with the wind. But my eyes were fixed on the silent white ridges ahead, where the real battle was waiting for us. We climbed out of the crater, our boots digging into the crumbling coral, and began our march into the white chaos. By the time we cleared the beachhead, the temperature had reached 115 degrees. The sun was a physical weight pressing down on our helmets, a brilliant forge that turned the island into an oven. The coral beneath our boots reflected the heat straight back into our faces. There was no shade, no moisture, only the endless expanse of glaring white rock that made the horizon shimmer in the midday haze. Every breath felt like inhaling dust from a stonecutter's yard, drying out our throats until we could barely swallow. The dust was a constant torment. A fine limestone powder rose with every step, hanging in the hot air like a dry fog. It clung to the sweat on our faces, forming a paste that dried and cracked in the sun. It got into our eyes, grinding against our retinas like sand, turning our vision red and watery. But more than that, it got into our weapons. The operating rods of our M1 Garands and the action of Bradley's BAR began to squeak and grind with every cycle. The gun oil we had applied aboard the transport had become a magnet for the abrasive powder. We had to clean the bolts with our thumbs every few minutes, scraping away the gray paste to make sure the firing pins would slide home when we pulled the triggers. The physical exhaustion was catching up, but the thirst truly began to break our spirits. Our canteens, filled with the metallic-tasting water from the ship's holding tanks, had been emptied during the initial rush on the beach. By midday, my tongue felt like dry leather in my mouth. Then came the word that a supply detail had managed to drag several 50-gallon drums of water to the edge of the scrub. We scrambled toward them, our dry canteens clinking against our belts. A group of Marines from the second wave was already gathered around the first drum, their faces eager, their hands trembling as they waited to fill their tins. But when the plug was unscrewed, the smell that rose was not the clean scent of water. It was the sharp, oily stench of high-octane gasoline. "What is this?" Bobby whispered, holding his empty canteen as he smelled the opening. "It smells like fuel." Hardy dipped his finger into the water and touched it to his tongue, spitting it out immediately. Gasoline. The drums weren't cleaned before they filled them. They must have used old fuel barrels. It was a devastating blow. The water was yellow and oily, with a thick film of fuel floating on the surface. Some men, half mad from heat, drank it anyway, desperate for liquid. Within minutes, they were on their knees, clutching their stomachs, vomiting up the oily water into the hot dust, their bodies racked by violent dry heaves. We were faced with a choice that felt like a death sentence: die of thirst under the tropical sun, or drink the poison and let it tear our stomachs apart. As we stood there in the heat, watching the sick men crawl toward the shade of the shattered ironwoods, Sergeant Hardy leaned close to the drum. He was looking at the white stencil painted on the side of the metal. It read, K-35. "Daniel," Hardy muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at the drums over there, the ones for the 7th Marines. Look at their markings." I squinted through the glare at the other water point 30 yards away. The men there were drinking freely, filling their helmets with clean, clear water. "They're clean," I said. "Why only ours?" "I don't know," Hardy said, his face tightening. "A logistics officer back in Hawaii could have made a mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. The Japanese were swimming in the lagoon last night. The Navy reported infiltrators near the supply ships. If they got to the beachhead before we did." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air, heavier than the heat. The thought that the enemy had actively poisoned our specific water supply before we even set foot on the sand was a terrifying prospect. It meant they were not just defending the island, they were manipulating us, controlling our survival from the moment we arrived. We had no time to ponder the mystery. The order came down to prepare for the crossing of the airfield. The Peleliu airfield was a vast, open desert of white coral concrete, 500 yards of flat, exposed ground with absolutely no cover. On the other side, the low scrub of the island's interior began, but it was lined with Japanese trenches, pillboxes, and concrete walls. As our platoon reached the edge of the clearing, the sun was at its peak, turning the concrete into a giant griddle. "We go on the whistle," Hardy said, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop for anything. If a man goes down, the corpsman will get him. Keep moving." The whistle blew, a sharp, metallic sound that was immediately cut short by the roar of Japanese artillery. We ran. The heat on the airfield was unlike anything I had ever felt. The concrete was hot enough to burn through the soles of our boots, the air shimmering so violently that the far side of the field seemed to float. My lungs burned with every step, the hot air drying my mouth until it felt like paper. Suddenly, a loud mechanical roar rose from the scrub to our right. Through the dust, we saw them. 3 Japanese Type 95 light tanks, their small tracks clanking, supported by dozens of infantrymen rushing forward in a desperate counterattack. "Get down!" Hardy screamed. We threw ourselves into a shallow mortar scar in the concrete. The Japanese tanks moved fast, their 37mm guns firing as they advanced, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. The infantry behind them fired their Arisakas, bullets snapping over our heads like cracking ice. Bradley didn't hesitate. He rolled onto his stomach, pushing his BAR over the lip of the shallow crater. The bipod slipped on the smooth concrete, so he guided it back, resting the heavy steel barrel directly on the hot rock. He opened fire, the rapid, heavy thump of the BAR cutting into the advancing Japanese infantry. He emptied one 20-round magazine, slapped another in, and kept firing, his body absorbing the heavy recoil. "Bradley," I shouted, firing my Garand at the infantry flanking the lead tank. "The barrel! You're smoking!" The barrel of the BAR was glowing, the metal expanding in the extreme heat of the sun and the continuous fire. The wooden handguard was smoldering, the grease inside the receiver beginning to burn with a white, acrid smoke. But Bradley didn't stop. The tank was coming closer, its machine gun chewing the concrete just feet from our position. In his haste to clear a jam, Bradley reached forward, his bare hand grabbing the hot steel barrel to slide the operating rod back. A sickening hiss of burning flesh rose over the sound of the engine. Bradley didn't scream. His face remained expressionless, though his jaw tightened so hard I heard his teeth grind. The smell of his own burnt skin rose between us, mixed with the odor of hot metal and cordite. His hand was blistered, the skin of his palm white and peeling where it had fused with the steel barrel. Yet, he pulled his hand back, wrapped it in a dirty rag from his pocket, and continued to fire, his injured hand gripping the hot wooden stock with a grip of iron. His fire held them. A bazooka team from the 2nd Squad managed to hit the lead tank, the rocket striking the turret and turning it into a boiling fountain of sparks. The other 2 tanks turned back, their infantry retreating into the safety of the scrub, leaving the airfield covered in a thick pall of black smoke and the bodies of the fallen. We dragged ourselves across the remaining 200 yards of the airfield, our boots sliding on the blood-slicked concrete, and reached the shelter of the trenches on the far side. We had survived the crossing, but the cost was high. Half of our platoon was gone, their bodies left behind on the white griddle of the airfield, exposed to the elements. By evening, the temperature dropped slightly, but the air remained thick and humid. We dug in for the night in a series of shallow trenches along the edge of the scrub, using our entrenching tools to chip away at the stubborn coral rock. Every strike of the shovel sent a jar of pain up my arms, the hard stone refusing to yield more than a few inches of depth. As the light faded, the flies arrived. They were green blowflies, huge and bloated, coming by the thousands from the airfield. The sound of their wings was a constant, low buzz that filled the trench and vibrated inside our skulls. Drawn by the smell of the dead, they settled on everything: our faces, our hands, and our food. We tried to eat our K-rations, opening the small tin cans in the dark, but the flies were relentless. The moment the metal lid was peeled back, they swam into the grease, their green bodies stickying in the cold pork and egg mixture. It was impossible to put a spoon to our mouths without swallowing them. Bobby sat in the corner of the trench, his face covered by his mosquito net, his eyes closed. "I can hear them, Daniel," he whispered, his voice thin. "Even when I close my ears, I can hear them. They're eating the boys out there. They're going to eat us too." "Shut up, Bobby," Hardy said, his voice tired. "Get some sleep. You're on watch in 2 hours." The night grew pitch black, the silence of the island settling over us like a heavy blanket. The only sound was the rumble of Navy ships on the horizon, firing flares that cast long, twisting shadows across our trench, making the shattered trees look like skeletal fingers. I lay in the dirt, my head resting against the rough coral, my Garand across my chest. My hands were dry and cracked, and the thirst was a constant throb, but I was too exhausted to care. Around midnight, while the rest of the squad slept, I sat watch. The air was dead, without a breath of wind. I leaned my head back against the stone wall of the trench, my ears straining to catch any sound of movement from the dark scrub ahead. Then, I felt it. It was not a sound, but a vibration, a low, rhythmic tremor that traveled through the solid coral rock and into the soles of my boots. I sat up, my heart pounding. I pressed my palm flat against the floor of the trench, closing my eyes to focus on the sensation. Clink, clink, clink. It was the sound of metal striking stone, but it was not coming from the scrub in front of us. It was coming from below, down in the dark. Beneath the feet of our sleeping squad, someone was working. The vibration was steady, the rhythm of iron shovels and pickaxes chipping away at the calcified limestone. The sound was muffled by feet of solid rock, but it was close, so close that I could feel the stone beneath my hand shiver with every blow. I looked at the sleeping men around me. Hardy, his face twitching in a nightmare. Bobby, his breathing shallow. Bradley, his burnt hand wrapped in bloody rags. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The enemy was not just waiting for us in the hills. They were already here beneath us, carving their way through the very rock we slept on. We were sitting on a honeycomb of steel and stone, and the floor beneath our feet was hollow. The flat concrete of the airfield gave way to the broken vertical maze of the Umurbrogol. What had looked from the beach like a low ridge of hills was in reality a jagged wasteland of gray limestone, pointing toward the sky like rows of rotten teeth. The Navy's shells had stripped every tree and bush from the slopes, burning away the jungle canopy and leaving behind nothing but a barren landscape of calcified stone covered in a thick layer of gray ash. The ridges were sharp as glass, the porous coral tearing our trousers whenever we tried to scramble for cover. Every step was a vertical climb, our boots slipping on the loose rock, sending small avalanches of stone clattering down the steep ravines below. The heat remained, but here it felt different, trapped inside the deep, narrow canyons where no wind could reach us. The sun beat down on the exposed stone, which absorbed the energy and radiated it back like the walls of a kiln. The air was thick with the scent of pulverized rock, sulfur, and something else. A faint, sweet smell of decay that drifted from the deep crevices where the dead of the earlier assaults lay unreachable. We moved dehydrated, our throats raw, our eyes bloodshot from dust and the blinding glare of the sun on the naked stone. But it was the silence of the hills that pressed on us the most. There were no birds, no insects, only the dry wind whistling through the cracks in the rock. The enemy was entirely invisible. They did not stand and fight. They operated from a massive interlocking network of natural caves and dugouts that had been reinforced with concrete and heavy steel doors. A bunker would open, fire a deadly burst of machine gun fire or a 75mm shell, and then vanish behind its steel shield before our artillery could respond. We were fighting a ghost army that lived inside the mountain itself, watching us from 1,000 hidden slits in the stone. Even when we managed to coordinate a mortar strike directly on an opening, the shells would only blacken the rock. The heavy steel doors behind the gun ports would slide shut, sealing the enemy inside their self-contained, subterranean world, leaving us to bleed on the barren slopes. "Keep your intervals," Hardy whispered, his voice cracking from the dry dust. He was crawling ahead of us, his body pressed flat against the hot coral. "Don't look at the ridges. Keep your eyes on the crevices." We were moving through a narrow pass, a deep cleft in the rock, with sheer limestone walls rising 30 feet on either side. It was a natural bottleneck, and we all knew it. The air inside the passage was cool and damp, a brief relief from the heat, but the tension was so thick I could hear the rapid ticking of my own pulse in my ears. Bradley was behind me, his hand wrapped in dirty, sweat-stained bandages, his BAR held ready. His burnt palm must have been in agony, but his face remained a mask of cold concentration. Suddenly, a sharp metallic pop echoed from the ridge above. "Get down!" Hardy roared. Before we could hit the shale, the canyon exploded into a hail of fire. The shots did not come from the front, but from the ridges above, the bullets striking the stone walls and ricocheting in wild, unpredictable angles. The noise was a deafening rattle of high-velocity snaps and shattering stone. Shrapnel from the shattered coral flew like knives, cutting my cheek and tearing the cloth of my sleeve. At the same time, Japanese knee mortars opened up, their shells dropping from the sky into the narrow passage. The explosions were deafening, the pressure waves bouncing off the stone walls and hitting our chests like physical blows. "Fall back! Fall back into the cave!" Hardy screamed. firing his Garand blindly at the high ridges. A mortar shell landed 20 yards behind us, throwing a shower of hot metal and gray ash over Bobby. The boy screamed, dropping his rifle as he scrambled backward on his hands and knees. I grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, dragging him through the smoke toward a small, dark opening in the wall of the canyon. Bradley covered us, firing short, controlled bursts from his BAR, the heavy thuds of the weapon echoing off the stone walls like thunder. One by one, we scrambled through the narrow opening, tumbling into the damp darkness of a natural cave. Inside, the noise of the battle suddenly faded, replaced by the heavy echoing sound of our own breathing. The cave was deep and narrow, the air thick with the smell of wet stone, mold, and stagnant water. Outside, the mortar shells continued to pound the canyon, the vibrations traveling through the ceiling and shaking loose small showers of limestone dust that fell on our helmets. We lay in the dark, gasping for air, our hearts pounding against our ribs. Bobby was shaking, his hands clutching his head as he wept silently in the corner. Hardy sat near the entrance, his Garand pointed toward the light, his hands trembling as he checked the action of his weapon. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed the cave was not empty. It had been used as a temporary shelter by the enemy. A low wooden bench sat against the damp wall, and next to it, on a small shelf carved into the limestone, was a collection of personal items left behind in the haste of their retreat. I crawled closer, my boots scraping on the wet floor. On the shelf lay a small lacquered wooden box, its surface scratched and covered in a thin layer of dust. Next to it was a small Japanese flag made of faded white silk, covered in vertical columns of black ink signatures, and a pair of small, wire-rimmed spectacles. I reached out, my dirty hand hesitating before I lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a young Japanese soldier in a clean khaki uniform, his arm wrapped around a young woman with a quiet, beautiful smile. Between them sat a small boy, no older than 3, holding a wooden toy. The soldier in the picture looked remarkably young, his face smooth and unlined, showing none of the horror that had consumed this island. Next to the photo was a small letter, written in elegant characters on thin paper, and a small dry leaf from a tree that did not grow on Peleliu. It looked like a Japanese maple leaf, its edges curled and delicate, preserved like a treasure. It was a fragment of a peaceful autumn in a country far away, a stark contrast to this barren island where the only season was the winter of death. I held the photo in my hands, the paper dry and clean against my sweat-stained fingers. For a long moment, the war outside seemed to vanish. I looked at the face of the man in the picture and realized he was no different from me. He had a family, a home, a life he had left behind in some quiet village in Japan. He had probably stood on the deck of a transport ship, just as I had, writing in his diary and wondering if he would ever see the sun rise over his home again. "What you got there, Miller?" Hardy asked, his voice low as he looked back from the entrance. "Nothing," I whispered. For a second, the impulse to slide the photo into my pocket as a souvenir crossed my mind, a token to show I had been here. But as I looked at the smiling child in the picture, a wave of disgust washed over me, not at the enemy, but at what we were becoming. We were turning into collectors of bones, taking teeth and flags from the dead to prove our survival. If I took this, I would be leaving a piece of my own humanity in this cave. I carefully placed the photo back inside the box, closed the lid, and set it back on the stone shelf next to the spectacles. I wanted to keep my decency, to believe that when this was over, I could go home and look my mother in the eyes without seeing a monster reflected in them. "We stay here until dark," Hardy said, his voice flat. "They won't come down into the canyon while the Navy is firing flares. But we have to set a watch. Bradley, you take the first. Bobby, you're on the outpost at the entrance." The night came quickly, bringing a cold, damp chill that settled into the cave. The Navy began firing illumination flares from the battleships offshore, the bright light filtering through the narrow entrance and casting long, skeletal shadows that danced on the wet walls. The sound of the water dripping from the ceiling was a slow, rhythmic tick that made the silence between the explosions feel even heavier. Bobby was stationed just outside the entrance, in a small, hollowed-out pocket of coral that served as an outpost. He was only 10 yards away, his silhouette visible against the occasional flicker of the flares. Around midnight, my watch came due. I crawled toward the entrance, my garand held low, my boots sliding quietly on the wet stones. The air outside was cool, a slight breeze whistling through the canyon. "Bobby," I whispered as I reached the entrance. "It's Daniel. I'm taking over." There was no answer. I crawled into the small pocket where Bobby had been sitting. The space was empty. My heart skipped a beat. "Bobby?" I whispered louder, my eyes scanning the shadows of the canyon. Nothing. The silence was absolute. I reached out in the dark, my hand touching a cold piece of metal. It was Bobby's helmet, lying on the edge of a jagged, dark fissure in the limestone floor. I pulled my small flashlight from my pocket, shielding the lens with my fingers so only a thin sliver of light escaped. I shone it on the ground. The fragile coral crust, weakened by our naval bombardment and the heavy rain, had collapsed. A gaping hole, barely wide enough for a man, had opened directly beneath the outpost. Bobby's entrenching tool lay nearby, the handle broken. He must have slipped in the dark, the crumbly limestone giving way under his weight. I leaned over the edge of the fissure, the draft from below smelling of wet stone and decay. "Bobby," I hissed into the darkness. From deep within the earth, beneath yards of solid limestone, came a faint, muffled groan. It was Bobby's voice, weak and distorted by the echoing chambers below. He was trapped down there, alive, but he had fallen into one of the natural cracks that connected directly to the enemy's subterranean tunnel network. If we didn't get him out, the Japanese patrols operating inside the mountain would find him before dawn. I stared at the dark opening, the thin beam of light disappearing into the black void. The mountain had literally swallowed him, the treacherous terrain of Peleliu proving just as lethal as the enemy's bullets. We did not wait for the dawn. The thought of Bobby lying injured in the dark subterranean veins of the mountain, surrounded by an enemy that lived in the stone, was a physical horror that drove away any desire for self-preservation. Hardy gathered the remaining men of the squad, his face set in a hard, grim line under the light of the naval flares. We checked our weapons, our movements quiet and mechanical, and prepared to enter the mouth of the labyrinth. The assault on the main cave entrance began at first light. The position was heavily fortified, a concrete bunker built directly into a natural cleft of the limestone, its gun ports spitting continuous fire. We had to approach it through a narrow ravine, exposed to sniper fire from the ridges above. Bradley lay flat, his bandaged hand gripping the stock of his BAR, providing a continuous wall of fire that kept the enemy gunners pinned. "Bring up the flamethrower," Hardy roared. A private from the second wave ran forward, the heavy tanks on his back hissing as he squeezed the trigger. A long orange jet of liquid fire shot into the darkness of the bunker, the intense heat instantly sucking the oxygen from the ravine. The smell of burning fuel and scorched concrete was overwhelming, followed by the muffled, terrible screams of the men inside. Before the smoke could clear, Hardy threw a satchel charge of TNT into the entrance. The explosion was a violent thump that shook the solid stone beneath our boots, collapsing the front of the bunker in a slide of white rubble. We rushed in through the dust, our bayonets fixed, stepping into the dark tunnels that lay beyond the ruined concrete. The interior of the mountain was a nightmare of narrow passages, smelling of sulfur, wet clay, and burnt flesh. We moved with our flashlights shielded, our rifles pointed into the dark corners. The walls of the tunnels were damp, the limestone dripping water that gathered in cold puddles at our feet. "Here," Bradley whispered, pointing his flashlight at a side passage. We found Bobby 20 yards inside, lying on the wet stone floor. He was alive, but his uniform was soaked in blood from a deep bayonet wound in his side. His eyes were glazed, his breathing shallow and rattling in the dark. He looked up at me, his lips moving but no sound coming out. "We got you, kid," I whispered, lifting him by his shoulders. He felt profoundly light, his body limp under the weight of his equipment. "They're coming," Hardy shouted from the main tunnel. The Japanese came from the deeper recesses of the cave, firing their Arisakas in the dark. The bullets ricocheted off the narrow stone walls, creating a deafening chaos of sound. We began our retreat, Bradley carrying the front of Bobby's stretcher while I held the back. Hardy stood at the junction of the tunnels, firing his Garand to cover our exit. I saw his rifle bolt slide back, empty, and before he could reload, a burst of machine gun fire caught him in the chest. He spun around, hitting the stone wall before collapsing into the dirt. "Hardy!" I screamed, dropping my side of the stretcher. I scrambled to his side, my hands instantly slippery with his blood. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his lips flecked with red foam. He tried to speak, his hand clawing my jacket, but his fingers lost their grip. The veteran of Guadalcanal, the man who had kept us alive through the white chaos of the beach, died on the wet dirt of a nameless cave. "Daniel, we have to go," Bradley yelled. A Japanese grenade bounced down the passage, its fuse burning with a faint spark. Bradley threw himself over Bobby, his BAR clattering against the stone. The explosion was a blinding flash that filled the tunnel with a thick, acid fog of white phosphorus. The smoke burned our throats and eyes, making it impossible to see or breathe. Bradley's BAR went silent, the heavy weapon falling from his hands as he slumped against the wall, his shoulder bleeding from shrapnel. I dragged Bobby by the collar of his jacket, my lungs burning from the chemical smoke, my boots slipping on the wet clay. I don't know how I found the strength, but I pulled him out of the narrow crack and into the bright, blinding glare of the canyon outside. Bradley stumbled out behind us, his arm hanging limp, his face covered in gray ash and blood. We fell onto the hot coral gravel, gasping for the warm, dry air. The battle for the cave was over. The charges we had placed collapsed the tunnels behind us, sealing the enemy and Hardy's body inside the mountain forever. A strange, absolute silence settled over the crest of Umurbrogol. The firing had stopped, the mortar crews having run out of ammunition or targets. The smoke from the white phosphorus hung in the stagnant air like a winter fog, turning the scorched hills into a landscape of ghosts. We sat on the hot white stone looking down at our hands. There were no victory celebrations, no cheers. We had taken the hill, but it was nothing more than a heap of burnt limestone and pulverized bone. While we waited for the stretcher bearers, I noticed the body of a Japanese officer lying near the collapsed entrance of the cave. He was a lieutenant, his uniform torn, but still showing his insignias. I leaned down, my hands still covered in Hardy's blood, and searched the pocket of his jacket, looking for a map or document that might help the battalion. Instead, I found a small leather-bound notebook. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, written in clear, precise English. On the first page was an address in Brooklyn, New York, and a date from 1939. I turned the pages, my eyes scanning the entries. He had been a student at Columbia University, studying literature. He wrote about his love for the autumn colors in Central Park, the cold winds off the Hudson River, and his hope that the growing tensions between our nations would pass. I stared at the English words, the handwriting neat and familiar, like that of a classmate. The realization was a heavy physical blow. The man who had directed the mortars that slaughtered my platoon, the man who had died defending this dark cave, was not a nameless monster. He was someone who had walked the same streets I had, who had read the same books, who had shared the same dreams. I closed the book and slid it back into his pocket. I did not take it as a souvenir. The truth it contained was too heavy to carry. The evacuation came late in the afternoon. The remaining men of K Company, only a handful of the 200 who had landed on White Beach 2, were marched back down the ridges toward the beach. We walked in silence, our bodies bent under the weight of our empty canteens and dirty weapons. As we reached the edge of the airfield, we passed the fresh, clean troops of the 81st Infantry Division. They were marching toward the front, their utility uniforms green and clean, their helmets showing no dents, their faces full of the nervous energy of men who had not yet seen the fire. They stopped to let us pass. They did not speak. They only stared at us with a quiet, wide-eyed horror. We must have looked like dead men walking. Our skin was black with soot and grease, our clothes torn and encrusted with dried blood and white salt. Our eyes were wide, fixed on the ground, showing the blank, empty stare of men who had seen too much. The 1,000-yard stare that no clean uniform could ever erase. They looked at us as if we were a warning of what was waiting for them in the hills. We reached the beachhead and climbed into the waiting LVT. The ride back to the transport ship was a silent, rocking motion through the calm lagoon. The water was no longer red, the tide having washed away the blood of the first wave, leaving only the twisted skeletons of the landing craft on the reef. We reached the side of the USS DuPage. I looked up at the towering steel hull, the landing nets hanging down like giant spider webs. The climb up the nets was the hardest thing I had ever done. My hands were blistered, my muscles trembling with a deep, systemic fatigue that made every step a struggle against gravity. I reached the deck and fell onto the cold iron plates, my breath coming in ragged gasps. A sailor in a clean blue shirt handed me a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee. I held the mug in my hands, but my fingers shook so violently that the hot liquid splashed over the rim, burning my knuckles. I couldn't hold it steady. My hands, the same hands that had held my Garand, that had dragged Bobby through the smoke, that had touched the blood of my sergeant, were no longer under my control. They belonged to the island now. I looked out over the rail at the outline of Peleliu disappearing in the evening mist. The white ridges of Umurbrogol were turning gray in the fading light, looking like a row of markers in a vast, silent cemetery. We had taken the island. They would write in the history books about the courage of the Marines, about the strategic importance of the airfield, about the victory in the Pacific. But as I sat on the deck, my hands still shaking against the warm ceramic, I knew the truth. We had not conquered the coral. The coral had conquered us. We had left our youth, our innocence, and the souls of our friends in those dark caves. And though our bodies were leaving, we would never truly go home. We would carry the white sand of Peleliu in our minds, a silent, burning desert that would follow us into the dark of every night, reminding us of the cost of surviving a war we could never hope to understand.